the liberal class or the liberal establishment is tolerated as long as it doesn't attack or question the virtues of the ruling class. Once you cross that line, for instance, like Noam Chomsky, you become a pariah. What we've undergone is a kind of corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. No country, France, the United States, controls their own economy anymore. Elected officials are essentially funded by oligarchic and corporate entities. I mean, Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign cost $1 billion. It's just a form of legalized bribery. Because on all of the major issues, there is no difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. They fight over cultural issues or tangential issues, but whether it's war, whether it's free trade agreements, wholesale surveillance, militarization of police, the carceral state, they're completely in lockstep. So what we really have is a ruling corporate duopoly. Well, Macron is the classic technocrat who serves the interests of corporate power and the oligarchic elite, and is quite willing to override popular sentiment to do it. So people are no longer taught how to think. They're just taught what to think.
Chris Hedges, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Je suis très heureux de vous recevoir sur la chaîne YouTube du site Élucide. Alors, vous êtes un célèbre journaliste américain. Vous avez reçu le prix Pulitzer. Vous avez été correspondant de guerre pendant une vingtaine d'années, du Salvador à la Bosnie, de l'Irak à la Palestine, pour de nombreux journaux, et en particulier le New York Times, dont vous avez fini par démissionner après vos propos qui condamnaient la guerre d'Irak. Et donc, vous avez entamé une carrière de dissident. Et on peut vous lire très régulièrement sur Élucide, ce dont je vous remercie. Alors, je vous reçois essentiellement pour parler de votre livre « La mort de l'élite progressiste », qui est très éclairant sur ce qui se passe actuellement dans nos sociétés. Alors, pour commencer, je vais vous demander tout simplement, c'est quoi l'élite progressiste et quelle est son histoire ?
Well, the liberal class has functioned traditionally in a capitalist democracy as a safety valve. It is allowed or tolerated because it will ameliorate a system that's off balance. So if there are egregious violations, if the system becomes too severe or too cruel or too tone deaf, then the liberal class works, and the perfect example would be in the United States, the New Deal, and to essentially protect the capitalist system from its own proclivities for self-destruction and for ruthless exploitation. But there are very firm parameters. The liberal class or the liberal establishment is tolerated as long as it doesn't attack or question the virtues of the ruling class. So once you cross that line, for instance, like Noam Chomsky, you become a pariah. But even more importantly, the primary mechanism used to discredit you is the liberal establishment, because within the society they have posited themselves as the moral arbiters. And when the system itself is questioned, or when the complicity of the liberal class is exposed by radical thinkers like Chomsky or Howard Zinn or others, then there is a fierce assault by that liberal establishment. They are used by the ruling elites to discredit the radicals. The perfect example would be, I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I'm an Arabic speaker. I was fully aware of the debacle that the war in Iraq would become, I think like most Arabists. And when I denounced the calls to invade Iraq. I was also, of course, aware that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. But to say that at that time was an anathema. And the primary forces that were used to attack me came from the liberal establishment, figures like Michael Ignatieff, for instance, who I know all these people, or George Packer or others. And I was attacked for my own inability to empathize. I mean, for instance, one of the criticisms was he comes out of the Middle East, but he doesn't want to liberate the people of Iraq. So that's how the liberal class functions. And that's why the liberal class is tolerated within a capitalist system. Roosevelt, when he passes the New Deal, actually in private correspondence to his brother, said that if we don't make concessions to the plight or deal with the plight of a dispossessed working class, we will get revolution. That's a word that he used. And Roosevelt later said that his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. So that is the primary function of the liberal class in a functioning capitalist democracy.
Vous définissez aussi la notion d'État-entreprise. Alors, qu'est-ce que c'est? Comment ça marche? Et quel est le lien eh bien, avec l'élite progressiste?
So, the political configurations, not just in the United States, but throughout most of the industrialized world, has changed with the rise of corporate power. And that has included a defanging of the liberal establishment or the liberal class. What we've undergone is a kind of corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. No country, France, the United States, controls their own economy anymore. And the system that we live under is probably best described as inverted totalitarianism. That is a term used by the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin, probably our most important, in the United States, our most important contemporary political philosopher. And this is all spelled out in his book, Democracy Incorporated. And Wolin says that what we've established is a system by which the images, iconography, language, symbols, even institutions remain the same. But internally, corporations have seized all of the levers of power. It's a bit like the facade of ancient Rome after the death of the Republic. You still have the Senate, but none of these institutions function anymore as democratic institutions. They've been perverted to essentially consolidate the wealth and power of a ruling oligarchic and corporate elite. And Wolin, who I knew, argued that the two mechanisms by which the population was rendered passive were access to cheap credit and access to cheap consumer goods. And I asked him if that access to credit was withdrawn, if those cheap consumer goods were no longer cheap, would that mean the system would revert to one that was more like a classical totalitarian system with a demagogue or a charismatic leader? And he said yes. And I think that that explains the rise of many of these demagogues, Orban, Trump, Modi, Erdogan, and others. But yeah, we don't. The press has been destroyed in the United States. The elected officials are essentially funded by oligarchic and corporate entities. I mean, Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign cost $1 billion. And it's just a form of legalized bribery, because once they are in Congress, the corporate lobbyists write the legislation. I mean, what's interesting is that most of the policies that are pushed through and turned into law don't have any popular support. I mean, often 70–80% of people, I mean, across the political spectrum in the United States, people want Wall Street held accountable, yet Wall Street is not held accountable.
Cette chaîne YouTube ne vit que grâce à vos abonnements à notre site. Si vous aimez notre travail, vous pouvez nous soutenir en vous abonnant sur www.elucide.media. Vous y retrouverez de nombreux contenus exclusifs pour aiguiser votre esprit critique.
Donc, dans votre vision, finalement, les entreprises ont arraché le pouvoir des mains des citoyens, c'est ça?
Yes, the corporate power is essentially so entrenched, so pervasive, that the citizenry has been destroyed as there is no, and of course coupled with that is the destruction of unions. So only about 11% of the American workforce is unionized, and many of those are in the public sector, meaning they can't strike. So yeah, power has been completely taken from the hands of the populace and put into the hands of corporations that essentially, I mean, this, unfettered, unregulated capitalism, because of its very nature, then will exploit a population or human beings along with the natural world until exhaustion or collapse. And that is why the environmental crisis or emergency is closely tied to the impoverishment of the working class, deindustrialization, the rise of the gig economy. And I think we have to also include the corporatization of the systems of information so that the parameters of acceptable debate have narrowed to such an extent that there is no debate. I mean, a good example would be when in the United States they were debating whether to intervene in Syria. The question in the corporate media was, should we use air power or should we use air power and also, in the slang, put boots on the ground? Like, those were the two options. That's a good example of how the parameters of debate have narrowed. And of course, voices like mine have been completely shut out because there is no questioning of the system itself.
Vous rappelez qu'Olin expliquait que finalement, un des éléments communs au totalitarisme passé du XXe siècle, qu'il soit fasciste ou stalinien, c'était finalement une très forte hostilité envers la gauche. On a l'impression qu'on a un mouvement de ce type qui se développe. Est-ce que ça vous inquiète? Est-ce que ça va empirer? Est-ce que c'est un signe que certains éléments du passé assez graves sont en train de se remettre en place?
Yeah, because as totalitarianism, any totalitarian system consolidates power, it loses a significant amount of popular support. And totalitarian systems that come to power almost never have majoritarian support. I think the highest the Nazis ever polled in a free election was, I can't remember, 37% or something. But so, and then as those draconian policies are put into force, critics of the system become more dangerous because they are giving voice to widespread feelings about the system, and they are calling for new systems. And just as the fascists in Germany or the Stalinists in the Soviet Union went after their critics, so does corporate power go after their critics. You have, well, I'm very good friends with Julian Assange. There's a classic example. So Julian did the greatest journalistic work of any journalist in our generation by exposing innumerable lies, war crimes, fraud, and the state is the totalitarian, corporate totalitarian state has become determined to make sure that he either spends the rest of his life in a supermax prison in the United States or is killed in the process. And it's not just that they're angry because they've been exposed, but it's also a warning to anyone else who might try this. So yes, I mean, Julian has also been effectively demonized by a corporate press. And we forget that, unlike Daniel Ellsberg, Julian never signed any kind of loyalty agreements to the internal security state or the military. He didn't actually steal the documents. They were leaked and given to him. And Ellsberg, of course, physically took the documents. So, and he's not American. I mean, there's a long list of he's not American. How can you charge him under the Espionage Act when he's not an American citizen? WikiLeaks is not a US-based publication, which is very disturbing for those of us who cover it because it shows how the legal system itself is completely bankrupt. There is no legal protection because they will violate all of their own rules in order to shut down anyone who threatens the centers of power. And my colleagues at the Times say at this point, it's impossible. Anybody with a conscience who might expose criminal malfeasance or any kind of the lies that are told by the state is too terrified, too frightened, with good reason. They know that they will be caught. And so we essentially have now reached a point where it has become impossible to shine a lens, which is the role of good journalism, into the inner workings of power. And history has amply shown that once power essentially is allowed to operate in secret, abuses by power exponentially increase.
Vous avez rencontré Fritz Stern, qui était un universitaire qui avait fui le nazisme, et vous avez donné d'ailleurs des éléments de réflexion que vous développez dans son livre. Quels étaient-ils et quelles leçons on peut en tirer pour aujourd'hui?
Yeah, Fritz Stern was one of the great scholars on fascism. He fled Nazi Germany when he was 18. He taught at Columbia. I knew him. And he wrote a book called Politics of Cultural Despair that looked at the roots of fascism. How is it that fascism arose in Germany was a fundamental question for him throughout his life. And he told me that there was a yearning for fascism in Germany before the word fascism existed. And I think we're seeing that same kind of yearning now in Western society because, as Hannah Arendt points out, fascism is about magical thinking. Any totalitarian system is about magical thinking. And when the real world becomes so unpalatable and so hostile, we see it with the rise of the Christian right, and I wrote a book, as you know, called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America, which is also in French. People retreat into a non-reality-based belief system. Anthropologists call it crisis cults. And there, one of the interesting things about the coverage of Trump when he was president is the press couldn't understand why all of the lies, all of the abuses of power that Trump carried out never outraged his base, his supporters. Well, it's because Trump functioned as a cult leader. And if you read about cults, Margaret Singer's Cults and the Myths or other books, when you're in a cult, you want your leader to be omnipotent. You want them to have total power. You want them to be able to defy any law, any norm, any regulation, because you as someone who is powerless has found an expression of personal power in the cult leader. And as corporate power has increasingly disenfranchised and disempowered the poor and the working class, the attractiveness of cult leaders, of totalitarian systems of magical belief become more and more seductive. So when I wrote my book on the Christian right, people who entered into the embrace of this ideology, I know because I spent 2 years on it and conducted hundreds of interviews, they had come from evictions, struggle with addictions, domestic abuse, prolonged or chronic underemployment or unemployment. It was despair. I mean, the first chapter of that book is called Despair, and that's why Fritz Stern talks about the politics of cultural despair. And Hannah Arendt also writes about this. It is despair, a despair that you see no way of getting out of, that propels you into the arms of totalitarian movements and totalitarian figures. And with unregulated, unfettered corporate capitalism, that despair, because there's no check or control on it, only increases. And then that feeds the political distortions that we've already seen ascendant.
Il y avait un autre point aussi qui était mis en avant par Wallin. Ce qui le frappait, c'était l'étroitesse des solutions proposées. Il n'y a pas les médias ne mettent pas en avant des grosses réformes. Quand on regarde, effectivement, l'éventail des solutions est assez réduit. C'est un des rôles des médias aussi, ça?
Yes, because they focus, as Wallin points out, on what Freud called the narcissism of minor difference. And you have a system that has become hostile towards the working poor, the working class. And the solutions that are proposed are tangential, even trivial. And even those don't get often embraced. So for instance, Biden campaigned on providing a $15 minimum wage, to providing free community college education. None of it happened. But these don't get to the, or don't in any way affect the centers of power that are carrying out the assault. And even then, none of it worked. None of it happened. And there was tremendous, as you point out, press coverage around very minimalist activity that might be able in some ways to mitigate in some ways the pain that's being visited upon the working class and the working poor, but won't staunch that assault.
Mais alors, à quoi servent les politiciens? Quel est leur rôle dans le système d'État-entreprise?
Well, political figures are, it's all vaudeville. It's all, first of all, the campaigns never stop. I mean, one campaign ends, one presidential election ends, and it's almost immediate that the next one begins. And it's all, it's content-less. It's about creating or manufacturing political personalities and selling them to the public. It's not about issues. So that's how you get the rise of a figure like Donald Trump, who has a fictional personality created for him as a business tycoon on the reality show The Apprentice. But I think Trump's success comes from the fact that he plays that game better than the traditional politicians. Joe Biden, for instance, is a very reactionary figure. And the reason that Obama picked him to run as his vice president is because, although a Democrat, he voted Republican. But Biden was behind NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that deindustrialized the United States and put millions of workers out of work. Biden was calling for the invasion of Iraq 5 years before the United States invaded Iraq, which of course was a war crime. Biden pushed through the 1994, he was in the Senate at this time, the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill that massively expanded the prison population in the United States. We have 2.3 million people incarcerated. That's nearly 25% of the world's prison population, although we are less than 5% of the world's population. Deregulating the FCC that allowed roughly a half dozen corporations to seize the airwaves and control what about 90% of Americans listen to or watch. The destruction of Glass-Steagall, the 1933 bill that put up firewalls between investment and commercial banks, which was ripped down. Canada did not have a banking crisis after the global meltdown in 2007, 2008, and we did. His policies are ones that have tremendously damaged the country, and just in a very personal way, the explosion of mass incarceration and the militarization of police has had terrible effects on millions of American families. But his record, there's a kind of historical amnesia in the coverage. And what you get is the projection of this fictional personality, this avuncular Uncle Joe. He calls himself, pro-labor president, working class. He comes out of the working class. But all of it is a fiction, because we had the railroad freight workers attempted to bargain for a new contract and were threatening a strike, and he used the Railroad Act, which allows the federal government to shut down strikes. So when he was campaigning, he talked about the importance of unions and labor and bolstering collective bargaining, and yet what he did is take away the right of collective bargaining from one of the very few entities or groups of workers that had the ability to. So it's all it's just all, it's political theater all the time, and the issues are completely ignored, because on all of the major issues there is no difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. They fight over cultural issues or tangential issues, but whether it's war, whether it's free trade agreements, wholesale surveillance, the militarization of police, the carceral state, they're completely in lockstep. So what we really have is a ruling corporate duopoly. And I think what's interesting, as it breaks down, is that with the rise of Trump and the conversion of the Republican Party into a party that essentially has a cult-like aspect around Trump, you have seen the traditional Republican elites, Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, along with the traditional right-wing pundits, Kristol and others, essentially migrate to the Democratic Party, and so the old Republican establishment has now fused with the Democratic establishment in an effort to hold back the rise of, this kind of authoritarian, neo-fascist, whatever you want to call it, that is embodied around a figure like Trump.
Et du coup, vous craignez qu'on bascule dans un régime encore plus dur de totalitarisme?
Yeah, we're sliding towards full-blown totalitarianism, because the tools used to control and monitor the public are far more sophisticated and pervasive than anything we've seen in human history, including I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. So they track us. We're the most photographed, watched, monitored population in human history. They control the centers of information, especially on social media through algorithms. They have effectively marginalized and even demonized critics, both from the left and the right of the system. And we know that in the end, the capitalist class will embrace totalitarianism rather than even tepid reform. So for instance, you had Lloyd Blankfein. He was the CEO of Goldman Sachs, a criminal organization in its own right, say that if Bernie Sanders was somehow the Democratic nominee, which was never going to happen, he and the other oligarchs, these are Democratic oligarchs, would support Trump. So in a way, that kind of the death of democratic institutions is being perpetuated by a ruling corporate oligarchy that refuses to carry out any kind of reform. I mean, Bernie Sanders was hardly a radical. He was a liberal in many ways, a traditional liberal, but because that's unpalatable for them, they have created the mechanisms by which this new form of corporate totalitarianism is inevitable, and they have all of the tools to make sure that any kind of opposition is crushed.
Mais alors, quel est le rôle de cette élite progressiste dans un système d'État-entreprise? À quoi elle sert, enfin, en tout cas, à quoi elle servait jusqu'à présent?
So in my book, I argue that the rise of the corporate state has destroyed the traditional liberal class to its own detriment, so that there is no safety valve. There is no force within the capitalist democracy that is able to restrain rapacious capitalism. And that is, I think, very short-sighted on the part of corporate power. And so the liberal class has been defanged, and it has busied itself with a kind of boutique activism. That's inclusivity and political correctness and what we call woke culture, but no longer functions as the liberal class did function. And that is really the theme that I hit in the book, and I write about all of the traditional liberal institutions, the press, academia, religious institutions, and that's very dangerous because there's no control. There's no control now. There are no restraints, and corporate power will do what it's designed to do, which is to extract and exploit in ever greater degrees, again, both the natural world, but within, and then that creates political distortions that give rise to demagogues. I mean, you have it in France, Le Pen and others, but that phenomena is common throughout the industrialized world because those forces are common in all of those countries. I mean, that corporate power has not just distorted the United States, but distorted, most industrialized countries, along with India, along with Turkey and other countries.
Alors, on va détailler un peu les différentes institutions, justement, qui permettent de soutenir cet État-entreprise. Vous insistez beaucoup sur l'université. Alors, quel est le rôle de l'université dans ce système?
Universities were targeted in the United States after the 1960s by corporate power. We have a memo by Lewis Powell written in 1971, the Powell Memo. He later went on. He was the attorney for the Chamber of Commerce for the business interests and then was later appointed to the Supreme Court. And it's a fascinating memo because it's kind of a blueprint for how to push back against popular movements, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the Black Power movement, the American Indian movement, etc., that had put significant pressure on the centers of power. And so he lists, what corporate forces have to do. Academia is very high on the list. He actually names Ralph Nader. I think it's the only name of a figure within that memo who has to be destroyed, and they, unfortunately, I used to be Ralph Nader's speechwriter when he ran for president. Unfortunately, they succeeded in really turning Ralph into a pariah. And academia was of deep concern. And so the assault on academia worked in two ways. First, public universities were defunded. City College, for instance, in New York City used to be one of the great universities in the country, and they stripped all the money from it. And that forced universities to depend on corporate donors or oligarchic donors, and they imposed all sorts of restrictions on what could be said, who could be hired. And this is true at elite universities. I've taught at Princeton. I did my graduate work at Harvard, which are awash in money. I think Harvard's endowment is about $23 billion. Princeton's endowment is, I don't know, it's not as much, but it's very high. And in fact, all of that money has constricted what is considered acceptable debate on a university campus, especially in economics departments. So I had mentioned Sheldon Wolin before. Wolin had taught at Berkeley and then later at Princeton. And in the 1980s, he called out neoliberalism for the fraud that it was. And the university turned on him. He was banned from, or essentially, he used to write for the New York Review of Books and all sorts of other liberal publications. He couldn't get published anymore. And he told me at one point, even within the political science department at Princeton, his colleagues were not speaking to him. And so there's an example of the intrusion of corporate money and corporate power to control the narrative within the university. You couldn't get tenure anymore within an economics department unless you embraced the neoliberal ideology. And the power of corporate or oligarchic donors increased as we stopped funding public universities. And so you transform these schools into vocational schools. You force departments to seek corporate funding, and those departments that are unable, and this would be most departments in the humanities, wither away. So whole departments are shut down. University of Washington, I spoke there a couple years ago, they had just closed their philosophy department. So you're training people to find a place at all levels within the educational system, within the corporate state. So if you go to a poor community, you are giving them a very basic or rudimentary education, a kind of numerical literacy that allows them to work in warehouses or fast food restaurants. If you go to a school like Princeton, then you're the biggest major at both Harvard and Princeton is computer science, is programming. And the danger with that is that with the destruction or assault on the humanities, you lose the ability to begin to ask the kinds of questions that challenge systemic power. You're trained to serve power in whatever capacity, but you're not trained to think. And that is just true now throughout the entire educational system. Because especially since these schools are so expensive, the first question that is asked once you enter the university, whether it's an elite university like Harvard or whether it's a state university, is this course going to further my vocational ends? Is it going to help me get a job? Am I going to, those are now the primary questions in a university. So people are no longer taught how to think. They're just taught what to think.
Vous expliquez d'ailleurs que ceci cause un espèce de vide moral, que d'ailleurs ils n'ont pas de bonne connaissance de leur civilisation. Quelles sont les conséquences?
Yes, what accompanies this is historical and cultural illiteracy, even amnesia. And when you don't know as a culture where you came from, you don't know where you're going. You don't understand that where you are in the present is the result of certain decisions, ideologies, and policies that we didn't, and that inability to connect with the past makes it almost impossible to critique the present. And that is true not just in terms of historically. I mean, for instance, if you want to get tenure at an elite university, then you're going to write a big, thick book about Ronald Reagan. I mean, I'm actually using an example from Princeton. But you're not going to write about those forces, including the Communist Party. In the 1930s, the United States had a very robust and powerful Communist Party, which has been completely written out of history. I think this is the importance of Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States. And Zinn himself was pushed out of Boston University and even to this day is attacked. But Zinn laid out the fact that the American political system was created by a white male oligarchic, largely slave-holding elite. And they had, from the beginning, disempowered. Women were not allowed to vote. People without property were not allowed to vote. Of course, African Americans could not vote. Indigenous Americans could not vote. And so Zinn follows from the revolution forward how all of the openings in a closed system were created not by the elite, but by popular movements, the abolitionists, the suffragists, the labor movement. We had the bloodiest labor wars of any industrialized country. Hundreds of American workers were murdered by gun thugs and state militias and the Pinkertons. Tens of thousands were blacklisted. Terrible anti-union laws, especially after World War I, but then again after World War II with the Taft-Hartley Act, et cetera. The civil rights movement. So all of the openings in American democracy, as in documents, came through the rise of these popular movements. That you're not going to be taught that. It is again the deification of largely white male power. FDR would be an example, again, coming out of the oligarchic elite, who gave us Social Security, who gave us the 8-hour workday. That's not true. There were tremendous strikes carried out through the 1930s that shut down the auto industry and everything else, and forced the hand of the oligarchic elite. And in that day, we had a functioning liberal class that was able to, they weren't radicals. They were used to discredit the Communist Party, especially in the 1950s. That truth of American history, that truth of the opening up of democratic space is one that I would argue probably most history students are not aware of.
Vous parlez aussi du plus grand péché de cette élite progressiste, qui est finalement sa collusion avec l'élite au pouvoir pour censurer, pour blacklister finalement ceux qui sont un peu rebelles à cette vision. Alors comment ça se manifeste et quelles sont les conséquences?
Well, this is the danger of corporate power, what Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism, because once you had the ascendancy of corporate power and the seizure of institutions that had allowed for some democratic participation in some democratic space, they made war on the traditional liberal class. And what they did is destroy the mechanism by which the system could avoid excesses. I mean, you had riots in Paris, and I've lived in Paris, and I've been out to the banlieues. Paris is a racist, segregated society, as, by the way, is the United States. I live in Princeton, which is, you have some black families, but usually they teach in the physics department at the university. We have cities like Trenton or Camden. Trenton's 20 minutes away. These are 90+% people of color who live in terrible poverty and terrible violence. So I don't want to pick on France, but because the United States has the same problem. And with the ruthless exploitation of corporate power comes, of course, an assault on social services. And the reason that there is an assault, I just came from London and I'm watching the NHS, the British Health Service, be privatized. Because as the state is disemboweled by corporate forces, i.e. you've deindustrialized, so you've moved your manufacturing to Mexico or Vietnam or China, wherever, the forces of corporate power become predatory or attempt to privatize the traditional social services of the state. So we have 17 intelligence agencies in the United States. Much of that work is privatized. Bose Allen Hamilton, that's where Edward Snowden worked. That's a private corporation. As cities have fallen into free fall, and American cities are in deep decay, they have to sell off assets in order to pay pension funds and pay city employees and even fund their budget. So what do? They sell the sewer system, they sell the parking meter system to private companies, electrical utilities. It all becomes privatized, like the healthcare service. And so you have, on the one hand, this force that impoverishes the United States or the working class. And then you have the rise of these privatized entities that further exploit an impoverished working class. And that triggers the kind of upheaval, whether it's rioting in Nanterre or whether it's the rise of a figure like Trump. You further polarize the society. The United States is a very polarized society. And the systems of information are destroyed under this assault. So, for instance, in the United States, the way the press is configured is very different from when I began. I worked for the New York Times. You had major media organizations, certainly very close to the power elite, but they sought to reach a broad audience. Now, press entities have been siloed to cater to a particular demographic. And they tell that demographic what it wants to hear. So, for instance, the whole idea that Russia was responsible for the election of Trump, which the Mueller report and this latest report, which was carried out by the establishment, imploded this idea. The New York Times spent 2 years, but in fact, the New York Times and the Washington Post won Pulitzer Prizes for reporting what we now know to be completely untrue, but they're not held accountable because they fed their readership, or in the case of MSNBC or CNN, their viewership, what it wanted to hear. So coupled with this catering to a particular demographic comes the demonization of another demographic, and both sides are no longer rooted in verifiable fact, which means that you can't communicate, which is exactly, I covered the war in Yugoslavia, which is what happened with Yugoslavia. You had ethnic groups, Croats, Muslims, Serbs, who seized centers of communication, and then you have a society that can no longer speak to it. So that's very dangerous, and then we have to, of course, deal with the fact that the United States, which has virtually no gun control and allows citizens to buy military-grade assault weapons, we have more than one mass shooting a day. It's a descent into kind of anarchic or nihilism.
Alors, vous expliquez aussi qu'en étant devenu très craintif, très policé, cette élite progressiste, finalement, a laissé quelque part le monopole de la rébellion à l'extrême droite. Comment on peut se sortir de cette situation?
Well, that's Julian Benda, with Raison de Leclerc. What happens with a bankrupt liberal class is that it essentially supports policies that are no longer liberal. And the perfect example would be the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration was a Democratic administration that pushed through NAFTA, that created the prison system. As I mentioned before, Biden was in the Senate and very involved in all of this. And the liberal establishment essentially remained loyal to a Democratic Party that, in essence, became the traditional Republican Party. So there was the anger towards the liberal class was, and it's a legitimate anger by a dispossessed working class, was grounded in the fact that the liberal class or that liberal element within the Democratic Party had betrayed them. So the lies that since the Clinton administration, the Democratic Party told to the working class, and it used to be that labor was a significant force within the Democratic Party, it no longer is, but those lies had far more dangerous or, had far greater consequences than the lies told by Trump. And I think that many supporters of Trump are not as naive as they are painted. They understand in many ways that Trump is a con artist and a narcissist, but he's become their revenge on an educated liberal elite that betrayed them. And Trump plays to that, and he knows that. And I think that anger is real. Within the American political system, you don't really get to vote for what you want. You vote against those forces you hate. And that is as true for those who vote for a figure like Biden as it is for those who vote for a figure like Trump.
Vous expliquez finalement parce que, comme ils se sont mis à détester cette élite qui les a trahis, ils détestent aussi ses valeurs, quoi. D'où le développement aussi du racisme qui a lieu dans les pays occidentaux.
Well, because the values that the liberal class says that it embraces are false. So the hypocrisy of the liberal class has turned them into a reviled entity within the society, especially by the white working class that has a sense of dethronement. But they're not wrong. The liberal class, by essentially not holding fast to traditional liberal values and allowing itself to be used by retrograde political forces, by neoliberalism, has destroyed itself and thereby destroyed its traditional role within a capitalist democracy.
Vous expliquez aussi que la peur est une des principales armes de l'élite qui est au pouvoir. Alors pourquoi? Comment ça se manifeste?
Well, fear is all they have left as a form of control, because the policies that they are putting forward are ones that are that further the interests of corporate and oligarchic power, not the interests of the public. So there's a constant effort across the political spectrum, whether it's within the Democrats or to make you afraid and to argue that, you know, we are the whether that's the right or the left. It's not the left, but whether it's the right. I mean, let's call look. The Democratic Party in Europe would be a far right party. I mean, and especially on the issue of war and permanent war. But the Democrats use it like the Republicans. It's fear of the other, fear of you know, what that competing political party would do within the country. Also, fear is used with 20 years of military debacles in the Middle East, just fiascos. But it was fear, and we had all the alerts, and that's not to discount the fact that there were 9/11, or you in Paris have, of course, suffered catastrophic, awful terrorist attacks. But coming out of the Middle East, I would argue that the rise of this radical jihadism is not unlinked to the reconfigurations that have happened under neoliberalism and the seizure of corporate power. I was based in Paris after 9/11 covering al-Qaeda, and it was clear that at least those Europeans, usually of North African descent, who were recruited, they lived out often in the banlieues, or certainly in very depressed areas. They had no real sense of identity. I mean, they may have been born in Algeria and come here when they were 3 or 4, but they would go back to Algeria and people would look at them as French, but the traditional French culture did not look at them as French, and usually they were involved in petty crime, and that's the kind of route that you get into this extremism or this radicalism. It's when people are cast aside. I spent a lot of time in Gaza. I knew Hamas very well. And there you have the world's largest open-air prison. I mean, it's hard to describe how awful the conditions are. You don't even have clean water in most of the dwellings, 10 people to a room. You can't get work. They can't get married because they don't even have the money by which they could start a family. And so the only way left for them to affirm themselves is to become a jihadist, even a suicide bomber, because at least after that action, pictures of them are put up around the walls of the refugee camp where they live. I mean, it gives them, there's no other way for them to affirm themselves. You've created a system where the only way that they left for them to affirm themselves is to carry out an act of terrorism, to kill. And I would say that ultimately that is, the engine of that is the system that we have created, whether that, and it's not just the apartheid state of Israel, but as well a system whereby you have huge members of the working class that, in the words of Marx, have been turned into redundant labor, human refuse. They're superfluous. They don't matter. They don't count. And that's why I think in the riots in Paris, you saw anything, even libraries, that represented state power being attacked. And I'm not defending the destruction of libraries, But I think that we have to be clear that that anger, that rage at being thrust out of the system, and then as you're thrust out, exploited by the very corporate forces that have made you redundant. I think ultimately the fault of that lies with the configurations of power, not with, the Algerian or Tunisian kids who live out in the Cité des 4000.
Vous pensez qu'il y a un problème de racisme en France?
Yeah, France is an extremely racist country. I mean, just in terms of the way people of color are segregated within France. And again, as I said before, that it's not unique to France. We also segregate people of color in the United States. But yes, the segregation and the demonization of people of color and Muslims. I mean, with the Charlie Hebdo incident, I took a very contrarian position in opposing the cartoons that mock the Prophet. The reason being that having spent so much of my life in very poor Muslim shanty towns and refugee camps, I was acutely aware that especially for Muslim youth, that's all they had. They had no structure in their lives other than praying 5 times a day. That was the only structure they had. They had no work. If they lived in Gaza, they were trapped in an open-air prison. They were under constant assault. I mean, as bad as apartheid was in South Africa, I don't think the apartheid regime ever bombed with fighter jets the townships. I mean, and so for those of us in the West with our affluence to mock the one figure or the one symbol, which is giving meaning and identity and a sense of worth to their lives, for me was unacceptable. And so I found that insensitivity, and I don't know that it was racist, but it was certainly ignorant, and it was certainly insensitive to the extremity by which these lives are led. And in France, like the United States, you have your own historical amnesia. I mean, for many years, you never dealt with atrocities of the Algerian conflict. I don't know to what extent you do now, but for many years, you didn't deal with that at all. I mean, that was a horror show, the Algerian War.
Alors justement, on en vient à une autre institution qui est très importante dans ce système d'État-entreprise, c'est les médias. Alors finalement, c'est quoi leur fonction principale?
So it used to have big media empires, Hearst newspaper, whatever. But with the rise of corporate power, the media has been bought up and by mega corporations. And so that the media becomes just one revenue stream in perhaps hundreds of revenue streams. And the pressure on all of those revenue streams is to create more revenue. And so when I began, all of the major networks had bureaus overseas. They had reporters, they had producers. That's all gone. If you look at the airwaves, certainly in the United States, they don't do news anymore. It's constant. What they do is they take a few main news items that have happened that day, and then show after show after show will essentially engage in commentary about those items. The push to create more profit out of the media industry has pushed the media closer and closer to a species of entertainment. And if you look at the way a news set is designed, it replicates the set of a sporting event. So you have, a constant obsession with polls, for instance. Everything has become a horse race. It's never about issues. It's who's up and who's down and what's the strategy. And you bring in, the goal is to create conflict. So you would bring in somebody from the Democratic, Van Jones, someone from the Democratic Party establishment, and then you would find somebody who supported Trump, and they would engage in, I wouldn't even call it a debate, in kind of slinging mud at each other. And there's a deep cynicism on the part of the quote-unquote host, and these are all news celebrities. They're not actually journalists, Rachel Maddow and others. And the people that they pick are often, quite consciously, they pick people who fit stereotypes. The stereotype of the poorly educated, bigoted Trump supporter, but on the other side, the stereotype of the kind of effete, elite, out-of-touch liberal. And that in and of itself, news has become a kind of reality show with, of course, the shift towards celebrity news. Celebrity gossip becomes news. The O.J. Simpson trial would be, I mean, that just preempted, it just went live. So the media now is so corrupted and so broken. And of course, the interesting thing is that it doesn't have any credibility. We know from polling that in terms of people who have confidence or respect for the news media, it's right up there with Congress. So people know the system. I mean, they get it. But it serves the interests of commercial. And of course, what you're also doing is dumbing it down. If you actually were covering or doing a story about a trade agreement, it doesn't lend itself to the entertainment value that is now cherished by news, so they just don't cover it. They don't cover foreign affairs, and they will engage in jingoism, where they have over Ukraine, but now we're watching a kind of Ukraine fatigue within the public, as was true in Iraq, as was true in Afghanistan, as was true in Syria, as was true in Libya, and what they do is they essentially just stop talking about it. Now, I wouldn't even use the word cover, because they're cheerleaders for these military debacles, but they just stop talking about it. So by the time America has to leave Afghanistan in humiliating defeat, people aren't even particularly conscious that the war was being fought. So yeah, I mean, the real press, those people who do not serve corporate power and attempt to deal with complex issues, as you do, we've all been pushed to the margins. I mean, figures like myself, or Matt Taibbi, Glenn, we were all mainstream figures essentially a decade ago. And because we didn't allow ourselves to be twisted or manipulated into fitting that paradigm, we've all been pushed to the margins.
En fait, un de vos collègues du New York Times résume finalement sa fonction principale dans le système en tant que journaliste. Vous pouvez nous la rappeler, nous dire ce que vous en pensez?
Right, this is Doug McGill, who said that he told his wife that his job as a journalist was to make the world safe for billionaires. Well, yes, of course. I mean, the New York Times caters quite consciously to the elite. They even have a number. It's 30 million. So that's 30 million people within the United States, it's a country of 330 million, who are either among the very economic elite or function as managers for the elite. And if you look at the advertising within the United States, or even within the New York Times, or if you look at the special sections, it's all about the issues that concern the very wealthy. Why? Because, of course, they want to attract advertisers who cater to this group. And what's happened even in the New York Times is that focus and that commercial interest has rendered probably 60+% of the American public invisible. So I wrote a book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, with a cartoonist, Joe Sacco, which is in French, and we went to the poorest pockets of the United States. If you go to Pine Ridge, the average life expectancy for a male is 48 years old. That's the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. 60% of the dwellings do not have electricity or running water. We were interviewing farm workers in Florida, which has the worst labor laws for agricultural workers in the country, and we interviewed undocumented workers from Central America who at night were chained inside a truck. And they were told that if they went to slavery, if they went to the authorities or the police, their families in Honduras or Guatemala would be killed. So you never see the 60% of American families don't have enough money to cover an emergency expense of $400 or $1,000. But because everything has become so corporatized and commercialized, it's not reported. I mean, nobody has labor. The New York Times, I think, was the last, and I don't think they have one anymore. Nobody even has a labor correspondent. And so the whole focus, I mean, this has always been true within elite organizations by the New York Times, but as the commercial model of the press has changed, that's become worse. Because remember, with newsprint, 40% of the revenue of newspapers used to come from classified advertising, which no longer exists. And then with the rise of the internet, the monopoly of a news organization to connect sellers with buyers is gone, because people, through algorithms, they can connect with you directly. And this has produced a tremendous economic assault on the media. And that economic assault has seen them become even more obsequious to the centers of power in a desperate bid to retain financial viability. But if you go to big cities, Philadelphia, Boston, the newspapers are, there's nothing left anymore because they can't get advertisers. I was in the newsroom of the Philadelphia Inquirer a little while ago. They used to have 750 reporters and editors. It's now down, I think, below 200. And it was quite shocking because when I walked in the newsroom, that meant that 3/4 of the desks were empty. So that economic assault has exacerbated the tendencies, which were already there, of news organizations to cater to the elite. And now they are even more craven about their subservience to the elite.
Vous soulignez que l'affaiblissement de l'élite progressiste a coïncidé avec le passage d'une culture basée sur l'imprimé à une culture basée sur l'image. Alors pourquoi et quelles en sont les implications?
It fosters historical amnesia. Most of these images are driven by corporate entities or promoted by corporate entities. It eviscerates the possibility of complex thought, and it cuts us off from our own past and our own history, not just in terms of how we got here, but even the world of ideas. So it's a kind of Huxley-like, world of perpetual entertainment. It's very dangerous. And in order to safeguard yourself from these very nefarious forces, you have to be proactive. You have to build walls. So I don't have a television. I'm not on social media, any social media. Now somebody runs a Twitter account for me. Somebody runs a Facebook page, but I've never even seen the Facebook page. I don't. And I read. I make sure and read. I mean, because if you sever yourself from a print-based culture and you're bombarded with images or cliches or slogans, then even if you are in opposition to power, you speak in the language power gives you. So for instance, you may be against the war on terror, but by using the phrase, the war on terror, you're already captivated by these centers of power, because the war on terror is a tautology. You can't make a war on terror. It doesn't make any linguistic sense. This is why Noam Chomsky is so important. And I think that why so much of his political critique, which I admire, comes from his brilliance as a linguist. So he always sees through that. Unfortunately, most people are passive consumers of information, and they speak in the language and cliches in which they're given, even if they don't make any sense. So, I mean, the conflict in Ukraine, and I know you've done very good work on Ukraine. I was in Eastern Europe, Central Europe in 1989. I was there when the promises were made to Gorbachev by Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker and others not to expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany, because remember that the unified Germany, it needed Soviet acquiescence. I mean, and the deal was that NATO, and not only would NATO not be expanded, but anybody who was there at the time would have told you expanding NATO was foolish, provocative, and dangerous. And yet it happened anyway. And if you even bring up that point, which is a historical fact, one I happen to have witnessed in the debate about Ukraine, you are immediately written off. So there's a good example of how you've severed yourself from the past in a kind of eternal present. You need historical context, and that's what we have lost. We've lost context, and once you lose context, then you really have no concept of where you are. You are very easily manipulated by forces that produce seductive images and slogans and clichés that take the place of thought.
En France, on assiste à des réductions de plus en plus importantes des libertés publiques, pas après pas. J'aurais vous demander, comme vous êtes étranger, quelle est l'image de la France? Comment vous voyez la France? Comment vous voyez ce que fait Macron depuis pas mal d'années?
Well, Macron is the classic technocrat who serves the interests of corporate power and the oligarchic elite, and is quite willing to override popular sentiment to do it, as we saw with raising the retirement age. He doesn't care that most people don't want it. I mean, that is how corporate power works. That's how inverted totalitarianism works. And it's not in any way peculiar to France. It's throughout, most of the industrialized world and countries like India and everywhere else. You're seeing this kind of inchoate rage towards all of the symbols and centers of power.
Alors, vous êtes finalement devenu un dissident. On en a beaucoup interviewé sur la chaîne. D'ailleurs, vous retrouverez des interviews de Noam Chomsky, de Seymour Hersh, de Daniel Ellsberg, qui vient de nous quitter sur cette chaîne. Alors, j'ai envie de vous demander comment est-ce qu'on devient un dissident? Comment vous êtes devenu dissident? Pourquoi il y en a aussi peu? Et le fait qu'il y en ait peu, quelles conséquences ça a sur la réaction de l'élite progressiste envers les dissidents?
I would say in my case there were two major forces. One, having covered war for so long, where it was very dangerous and it was very common that those I was working with were killed. I mean, large numbers, including my closest friend, did not survive. And so when one is willing to put themselves physically in that kind of risk because they are seeing the kinds of atrocities that I saw in El Salvador during the war, or in Gaza, or in Sarajevo, then you are essentially defying a system that is quite literally trying to kill you. And so I would say that is a kind of, gave me a kind of protective shell once I came back to the United States, in that I had spent 20 years facing these kind of very dark forces that were trying to destroy me because of the reporting that I was carrying out. So that was number one. And number two, I would say, because I come out of a religious background. I graduated from Harvard Divinity School, and I think there's a kind of understanding that one stands up, that for truth, insofar as we can determine truth, for justice, that there's a moral imperative to do so. And also an understanding that usually you don't succeed. And so that it's not, you don't fight fascists because you're going to win. You fight fascists because they are fascists, or you fight evil because it is evil, radical evil, if you want to quote Kant. So, and I'm not a careerist. I didn't go to cover the war in El Salvador or Sarajevo because it furthered my career. In fact, careerists don't usually go cover wars seriously because it's too dangerous. So I think those forces protected me. Certainly understand power. Having worked for the New York Times, I know I don't expect to be rewarded in any way. In fact, I expect the opposite. I think part of it is understanding or being prepared for what the consequences are. And then empathy. I mean, the fact is that I've seen tremendous human suffering. And whatever my position is on the Palestinians or whatever assaults that I endure, it's nothing. Because I've spent so much time in Gaza, it's nothing compared to what Palestinians in Gaza endure. So it's empathy and a kind of loyalty. And I used to say there's only two types of foreign correspondents or war correspondents, those who care and those who don't. And if you care, you're going to get into political trouble.
Mais donc, comment réagit l'élite progressiste contre les dissidents?
Well, the liberal class is used to discredit the dissident because the dissident is critiquing the system. The liberal class is used to critique the excesses of the system while defending the system at its core as virtuous and well-meaning.
Vous expliquez que, par leur soif irrationnelle de pouvoir et d'argent, ceux qui exploitent l'humanité et la nature sont en train de nous mener au suicide collectif. Pourquoi ils n'essayent pas d'empêcher ce suicide?
Well, because the liberal class has been reconfigured. So the definition of the liberal class is not what it was when it attempted to carry out reform. The liberal class now is defined through its linguistic mannerisms, the woke culture, identity politics, political correctness. But the whole element of class struggle, the whole element of economic injustice has been eradicated from self-identified members of the liberal class. I don't think traditionally a figure like Bill Clinton or even Barack Obama can be considered liberal, but those are, they have assumed the mantle of liberalism while, of course, destroying what liberalism once was. And that's why they're part of the system. And woke politics or diversity, that doesn't in any way disrupt corporate power. It's a species of internal colonialism where you would promote, Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court, but of course, even though he's black, Clarence Thomas serves the forces of the far right. So those forces are quite comfortable with having a figure like Clarence Thomas or Condoleezza Rice or whoever, because they help give validity to a system of exploitation. And the liberal class has now essentially joined that campaign of diversity. But that diversity is in the service of a system of oppression. And by the way, Stalin was very good about that. So people forget that women and all sorts of ethnic groups, and as long as they back the purges.
Vous avez une très belle phrase aussi que j'ai envie de citer. Vous dites « L'État-entreprise cherche à nous inculquer l'indifférence au sort d'autrui et le culte de soi. Pour étouffer la compassion, il fait appel au plaisir comme à la peur. La culture de masse et la propagande cherchent à éradiquer la résistance, cette aptitude à dire non. » Dans un tel système, comment on peut lutter contre lui, sachant qu'évidemment les grandes entreprises ne vont pas vouloir de réforme?
Well, what they've done is what corporate power, what consumer society has done is essentially refocus all of our individual energy into the cult of the self, and celebrate the values, or the dark values of the cult of the self. So how does one succeed in the society? Well, it's through manipulation of others, through lying, through a lack of empathy, through a lust for power and a lust for other. If you watch reality television, those are all the values that are being held up as. And with those values, you destroy the possibility of any kind of collective solidarity. And of course, we as individuals, the only power we have is within the collective. Yeah, that's why unions are so important. And that creates a kind of political and cultural climate where we are complicit in our own disempowerment. That, you know, we seek identity through brands, we are obsessed with social media, it's called, you know, of ourselves. I mean, everybody can be their own celebrity now. It's kind of Life, the movie. All of these very, you know, negative forces have crept into our daily lives. You just walk down a street in Paris and it's the selfies and the posing for the selfies and the influencers. And so it's even worse than lacking the capacity to say no. It's lacking the capacity even to ask the question that might lead to no.
Pour conclure, je vais citer une dernière de vos très belles phrases. Vous dites « Les médiocres qui dissimulent leur sentiment d'inutilité et de vacuité sous le masque du pouvoir et de l'illusion en essayant de nous imposer leur pernicieuse idéologie, craignent par-dessus tout quelque chose. » Qu'est-ce qu'ils craignent tant?
They fear most those who speak in the language of love, because love is antithetical to the objectification of human beings, the manipulation of human beings, the idea that human beings are an object that one uses in order to garner profit. So for instance, in the United States, if you're a poor person of color living in a depressed urban area, your physical body is worth nothing to the state. But locked in a cage, you can generate $50,000 or $60,000 a year for prison contractors and private telephone companies and commissaries, and even the medical is privatized. Everything's privatized now within American prisons. And that is the language of exploitation. And those who speak in the language of love, those who believe that we should invest in people rather than systems of control, essentially by rooting ourselves in the primacy of, or even the sacredness of others, find ourselves diametrically opposed to these corporate forces.
Eh bien, nous arrivons à la fin de cet entretien. Merci beaucoup. Ça a vraiment été un grand plaisir, une chance de vous avoir à Paris, en Europe, puisque vous venez d'ailleurs soutenir la famille de Julian Assange. Je vais vous poser notre question traditionnelle. Qu'est-ce qui est connu de peu de personnes et qui mériterait d'être connu de tous?
That the greatest evil is the evil we carry within us. It's not external. And that if we're not aware of that evil, we will commit evil in the name of goodness.